Hello, Global Theater. My name is Jerry Fielka. Today is October 26, 2022. We want to thank Rob Grant and his amazing podcast. I'm probably wrong about everything. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with Steve. You're going to have to pronounce your last name so I don't murder it. Steve
Well, in the United States, if you just pronounce each letter, you can pronounce Italian names very well. So it's Isoardi.
Isoardi.
But
That's good.
if you're in Italy, it's Isoardi.
Ah, that is good. Beautiful. So the first question, Steve, is what's the best thing for a human being?
What's the best thing for a human being? Music and community.
Oh, I love both those words. What's your favorite form of information? How it comes into you?
My favorite form, especially given what I've done, is direct, live, person to person conversation.
Isn't that the greatest? I agree with you 100%. Why do you think humans collect or gather information?
Ooh, my goodness, that's a pretty big question, loaded question. Metaphysically, philosophically, anatomically, I think there is certainly it most importantly, it's a way of understanding your situation, where you are, why you are where you are, and where you may be going. And a large part of that is gathering information to understand that, as well as understand what led you to wherever you're at now, understanding the past, both your role in it, your predecessor's role in it, etc., is all a way of making you a better person and enabling you to make better choices in your life.
Really beautiful. Well put, Steve. Do you think this need or want to collect information is more innate in humans or more in?
Or,
Say it again.
oh, you didn't finish the sentence. The last I
Oh,
heard was
I
more.
might have got cut up. Is this need or want to collect information more innate in humans or more invented by humans?
I think it's something that gradually emerges as our species evolves socially.
Yeah.
I think it's something, it becomes very important very early on. I think in any species has to learn to survive, where to gather food, where it is safe, etc. That's all gathering information. In our case, the more we evolve socially, the more pronounced it becomes and the more complex and developed it becomes.
Do thoughts create emotions?
Yeah, there is certainly a dialectic at play between thoughts and emotions, but I do think thoughts are more a way of processing emotions and emotional reactions, which are more instinctive.
Fill in the blank, Steve. I don't know what I think
Until I experience it.
nice. Yeah, McLuhan says, I don't know what I think until I say it. And Joan Didion says, I don't know what I think until I write it. So I like this word experience because it goes back to my favorite thing. What's the best is direct experience, live
Yes.
direct experience.
Yeah, I mean, it's important because then you know what you think. Otherwise, it's the way of being certain. It's the way of playing it out. I like the word to explore
Yeah.
and to experience. Those are two of my favorite words, especially in music. And I really have a bug about the word experiment in the arts and in music, especially when I hear that musicians are experimenting. Avant-garde musicians are experimenting with this and that. To me, it's like being in a lab, an
Yeah.
all-white laboratory setting, and it creates a distance between the creator and what you're doing. And I've never liked that. Whenever I hear musicians talk about how their music's experimental, I just sort of have a feeling, well, they're not fully engaged with this then. to me, it's exploration and experience. That's what the creation of music is. It's exploring. It's
Dude,
not experimenting.
yeah, we're gonna have a ball. We're gonna get into music soon, but just to top that off, it's funny because Thelonious Monk said music is math, you know, and you gotta admit, he was pretty damn experimental in a way. I mean, he was doing stuff that was sort of avant-garde, but it was almost pushed so far. But let's finish off these philosophical and then we'll jump into music. Can humans think without language?
Well, I think humans can think because of their composition, but without language, it sets limitations on
Yeah.
what you can think.
Yeah. Chomsky says a language is not just words, it's a culture, a tradition, a unification of community, a whole history that
Yes.
creates what a community is.
Yes,
What
every
do you,
word has so much embedded in it.
totally. What do you do when language breaks down? When language doesn't work, what do you do?
You find other ways if it's necessary.
Yeah.
There are other ways of expressing. For instance, to jump ahead a bit, a person I spent a lot of time with and interviewed quite a bit was the great jazz musician Horace Tapscott.
Yeah.
And a lot of times when I was interviewing Horace, he would stop talking in a sense, and he would kind of jump up and physically take over. His body would express gestures, etc., would complete his thought.
Yeah.
And that to me was a classic case. I mean, it was a bit frustrating as an interviewer, especially when you're going back trying to transcribe an interview. But I could see what was going on, and I could see what he was trying to express, that his bodily language was more, conducive to him, to expressing that thought at that moment rather than just speaking some more.
Yeah. Hey,
So,
being you with your Italian roots, it's like, hey,
hey,
hey, what's up? What?
I
What?
can't talk without being able to use my body.
So, your observations of humans in general, I know it's both and it depends. Are we more thinking beings or more feeling beings?
Ooh, well, it's hard to make that kind of a separation. I don't
Yeah.
think in terms of, to me, most dichotomies, the interesting thing is not simply establishing dichotomies, but showing how they really blend and how they
That's
combine.
it.
That's the more interesting approach to it. And I think that's the case. I mean, there's no question that our thinking and our ability to think expands as our species evolves.
Yeah.
And depending on need, and certainly when we start settling down, the need, for more kinds of exchanges, social interaction does tremendously expand the ability to think because there are more tasks, it becomes more complicated, et cetera. So I tend to think of them, in harmony, if you will, and evolving in that dialectic.
Yeah. Beautiful. See, you get it because, whoops, we're getting a little echo. Maybe you can go to your settings really quick and make sure the on the audio at the bottom you hit audio and then your echo cancellation button is got a blue check in front of it.
I see audio. Do I click on audio?
Yeah, then you click on audio
Okay. Yeah,
and then
echo cancellation is checked.
okay, then forget it. That's all right. We're all set. And then exit out and we're continue.
All
Okay,
right.
so that was good because you get it. I like a woman I interviewed recently. I said, "Is it more this or more that?" She goes, "The word more doesn't function in your question."
I
So,
like that.
so so in essence, even though I ask you it, it's just a jumping off point. If I say, "Is it more this or more that?" You did it. You just jump off and go wherever you want. It's not that you have to answer the question.
Of course.
So these are two questions from Alan Turing, 1950s. Is thinking a function of the soul?
Well, I think it's essential for the development of the soul.
Yeah.
As same with emotions, etc. They're all part of an integral part, connected in terms of us evolving.
The second Turing question is, can machines think?
Well, I don't know enough about AI to answer that with any kind of depth or competence. We certainly do know they can calculate,
Yeah.
but can they, how, where are we at now in research? Can they actually think beyond the limitations that we input into them? That's a whole, I think most people working in that field would say to some extent we probably can now, and we certainly will in the future, but I don't know.
Yeah. And that's what I like. Feel free to say, I don't know, but also what I'm after, Steve, is your hunch or your guess. So that was great. Do you more pursue happiness or more pursue meaning?
Oh, meaning.
Does the brain more detect consciousness or create it? Like, is consciousness there bubbling away and we're detecting it, or are we actually creating it?
No, that's another example to me of a dialectical connection.
Right.
It completely intertwined.
It's
Can't
both.
have one without the other.
Yeah. What's faster, speed of light or speed of thought?
Depends who you're talking to. I know some people who couldn't approach speed of light if their lives depended on it, such as much of the political leadership we're saddled with.
You anticipated the next question beautifully. You must have ESP. Audre Lorde said, "You can't dismantle the master's house using the master's tools." Yvonne Rainer responded to her and says, "You can if you expose the tools." What new tool do you suggest?
To dismantle the master's house.
Well, that's interesting because what I'm basically doing is I open some of my questions with cute quotes. It doesn't mean you have to put them into the context of the quote. Again, it's you choosing where you want to put the question in the context you want. So it's sort of assumed it's like the master's house, which can be interpreted many ways, you know. I mean, the
Yeah.
master could be your boss at your college or the guy who's booking Horace Tapscott or the political leader in town. But it could be, you know, like Frank Zappa said, who are the brain police? Could be the master could be your brain.
Well, I think there is ultimately always a way to dissemble the master's house.
Yeah,
Finding the correct tools may take a while,
yeah.
but I think there is always a way to do
Good. What new toy do you suggest?
that. To do that,
Well, again, you put it in the context you want because I was asking that for 30 years, and then someone says, "Well, I don't know about a tool, but I know I have a toy." And I goes, "Fine, you know."
I don't know. It would probably be case specific, I guess, is
Yeah.
what I would say.
What do you worry about when you go to bed at night?
What do I worry about when I go to bed? Getting a good night's sleep.
I like it. That's practical. So Marshall McLuhan learned from the poet Ezra Pound that artists are the antenna of the race. And you know, by artists, I mean musicians, researchers, painters. They're the antenna of the race in their broadcasting and detecting the hidden psychic effects
Yeah.
of our inventions so that we might learn to how to cope with what we don't like about the inventions. So I ask you the question McLuhan probed his whole career. Why do we humans ignore the hidden psychic effects of our inventions, even though the artists are broadcasting them to us?
Because they serve other purposes that meet people's immediate needs,
Yeah,
despite the potential fallout.
yeah,
I mean, which happens in many areas across the board. Uh, Look at, I mean, something like climate change. I mean, my God, it's pretty clear, but most people, if you're a coal miner, what are you going to do?
yeah,
It's terrible. So there is a thing that goes back many years ago to when I was in graduate school and my focus was decision making, there is a phenomenon called irrational persistence,
Yeah.
where people will pursue, a course of action that is irrational. It makes no
Yeah.
sense, but they won't change course. And the
Yeah.
question, which of course has happened so many times, I mean, in my field, in international politics, but it happens a lot. And that's a whole other phenomenon.
Amazing. Do artists have moral obligation?
Uh-huh. Well, they do, but that's a very complex area because there are moral obligations in terms of your compatriots, your comrades, in terms of society, but there is also the moral obligation that an individual artist has to do the best they can to realize themselves as artists and their vision. They don't necessarily always go together,
Yeah.
and which can certainly happen. And then it's a hard decision to decide which way to go. I knew an artist who had done a project that carried some consequence and importance for a community, but was someone who personally was not in a situation where they could stand as that kind of a spokesperson. They just aren't that kind of a person. And so what do? There is certainly you do certain kind of work that has an impact, and you would think there is partly a moral obligation to further that to help others. But on the other hand, you can't do that to yourself. It's not who you are. It's not what your personality is, and could in fact damage you. A lot of tough choices. Very tough.
Steve, this is really exciting for me because I'm really learning a lot. I appreciate this. Thank you so much. Are you more afraid of new ideas or more afraid of old ideas?
Oh no. Well, there some old ideas I'm very afraid of these days, such as fascism. There are, but no, I welcome new ideas.
Yeah.
Very much so. There are so many old ideas in ascendancy now which I never thought would happen in my older years. And I
Yeah.
keep hoping. I know the cycle will turn, the wheel will turn. I just hope I'm still around when people
Yep.
are again embracing new ideas and moving forward. I'm waiting for it.
Can you conjure up your earliest memory ever or one of them?
Earliest memory ever?
Yeah.
Ah, I've got one that over the years, I've thought of. I don't know if it's absolutely my earliest, but it's when I was no older than 3. And whether I was 2 or what, I'm not sure. But I actually have 2 very strong memories when I was that age. And I remember it well because I'm the oldest of 4 siblings, and we were living in San Francisco then. And 2 strong memories were, 1, my mother sitting with me all the time and reading to me from books. And we would spend hours just doing that. And I think obviously that's one of the sources of my love of reading and books. The other one is on Wednesday nights, I could not get to bed. I would not fall asleep until I heard my dad pull up in his car. Wednesday night he had his union meeting. He was a Teamster, and he would drive to the Teamster local, which was down the peninsula from San Francisco. And so it'd take him a while to come back after a day of work and then going to the meeting. But I couldn't go to sleep until I heard him pulling into the garage.
Wow. Those were really well described. Tell me someone within your immediate family, then outside your immediate family, just briefly, who had an impact on you like a role model, and what specifically was the impact?
Oh goodness. Well, there's a lot to in a way, there's a lot to choose from. Um,
But just off the top of your head, like one
well,
inside the
my
family,
I'd have to go to my father, who had a
what'd you
big influence.
mainly get from your dad, you think?
When I was 4, I walked my first picket line with him.
Wow.
And that was huge. It's when I first became aware of, you know, kind of the outside world in a way for a little kid, pre-kindergarten kid.
That is beautiful. That brought a tear to my eye. I love it. I love when people do that. And then they learn it from their parents. Like I remember my dad babysat my sister's kid once so she could go protest the war. And he fought in World War II and he didn't complain. You know, Dad, you're great. You're willing. So now
So
I was
between my father and union politics and my mother and reading, much of my life was shaped by the time I was 4.
that's pretty dang good. You really now outside your immediate family, sort of early on or any age had a major impact on you? Just
Oh,
briefly, what was
gee,
it?
well, I mean, there are so many people looking back. Now, when you say that, do you mean people that I actually knew, encountered,
Doesn't this
people I
again,
read
you
about, people's
no,
books?
again, it's you put in the context you want. Yeah, it doesn't have to be you knew them. They had an impact on you and were kind of a role model.
Well, I mean, two historical figures that had a big impact on me were Marx and Trotsky,
Well, there you go. What did you
and
mean?
they
Yeah.
they shaped they shaped my life, much of my adult life.
Wow. Okay, we're
And
gonna give it yeah, go ahead. I mean, if
no,
you
no,
wanna sum it up, because 'cause we're gonna get into politics a little. Let's move on because then when we get it did your parents raise you a particular religion?
Italian.
You mean
One guess.
Roman Catholic.
Oh yeah.
Do you pray?
No,
If God exists, what do you want God to say to you after you die?
I deny the initial premise. I don't.
Nice.
I don't. Believe in fantasies, in fairy tales, in myths, those kinds of myths, etc. They haven't been part of my life since I was a senior in high school.
Steve, I appreciate your honesty. Do evil people exist, or does evil use people as a vehicle?
Well, that assumes that there is something called evil existing in the ionosphere or something. I think that it's a function of social evolution,
Yeah.
and which puts people in situations and leads to that. I mean, the cause of evil, people doing evil, is huge: social, individual, familial, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, this is the follow-up and might elaborate things. How do you advise someone to deal with an enemy? And let me set it up with a few modern thinkers. Alan Watts says, if you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them. Coppola stole from the mob and the samurais. Keep your friends close and your enemies closer. JFK said, forgive your enemy, but don't forget their name. And Fellini says, I need an enemy. So it's a lot of thoughts. Basic question is, how do you, Steve, advise someone to deal with an enemy? But first, how would you respond to Alan Watts? If you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them.
No, I don't agree with that at all.
Yeah.
I I mean, by ignoring fascism, by acknowledging fascism, you're empowering it. What does that mean? You ignore it. You don't say anything about it. You don't do anything about it.
Yeah.
That makes no sense to me.
Yeah. So how, I mean, just in general, how would you advise someone to deal with an enemy?
Well, it depends. It depends what the context is. I
Yeah.
mean, if I'm being confronted by, or if you're trying to deal with a planned march by a number of Klansmen or Nazis, the way you respond to that and deal with that is going to be very different from having a philosophical, theoretical disagreement with an individual over something. In the former case, you're going to want to confront them. You're going to try and outmobilize them. You're going to get every working person you can out on the streets to sweep them off the streets.
Yeah.
In the other context, a discussion.
Wow. It's great. You know, with the first thing you said, with the Klansmen, that's what Susie, my wife, is a huge Bessie Smith interpreter, and
Yes, I know.
she knows Bessie Smith's life inside and out. And the Klan came and were taking down a tent that she was gonna sing in one night. And she goes up to them and goes, "What the fuck are you doing? Get the fuck out of here!" And you could just see Bessie Smith scaring these white guys.
No
Ah!
kidding. No kidding. You didn't mess with Bessie Smith.
But I love your dialogue thing. Actually, we should just jump into politics a little before we get into music because you're so well versed. What's the difference between rebellion and revolution?
Well, they're used interchangeably
Yeah,
in so many cases. I mean, it just offhand, revolution sounds like a more politically evolved
yeah,
position rather than just rebellion in the streets, et cetera, et cetera. Like there's a word I use. I mean, I've written about uh, the Watts uprising of 1965 and even the uprising of 92 in LA. And I know a lot of people talk about them being revolutions or something like this, which I don't think is appropriate at all. It gives it too much focus and direction and programmatic basis, which there never was. There are certainly uprisings, you might even say to some extent on the part of many individuals, rebellions, but there was no political program. There was no leadership to give it focus and direction, et cetera. So I prefer in cases like that using the word uprising or
yeah,
even upheaval. And rebellion, could apply to some extent too, but revolution, no.
yeah. Because I like you said evolving, or you said some E words at the beginning, but revolution has re-evolving, meaning we know there's something wrong, and here's our new plan. We're evolving. We have something to offer. But Utah Phillips, political songwriter, said
Yeah, I
anarchy.
love it.
Yeah, he said anarchy is making rules for yourself and not other people. Who's entitled to make the rules?
Yeah. You're asking?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I set it up with his quote, anarchy is making rules for yourself and not other people. So my question is who is entitled to make the rules?
Yeah, well, that comes out of, I mean, it again, depending on your politics, for someone like Utah, it would be the working class. It
Yeah.
would be the organized working class, which
Yeah.
makes its rules,
Yeah.
and which ultimately, as its politics evolve, is in a position to make rules for the bettering of society.
Yeah. How do we keep our governments from going to war?
Revolution.
Wow.
It's endemic to
Yeah.
capitalism. Capitalism is basically a viciously competitive, conflictual system, and it happens economically and politically, and it leads to that. It's the only way of resolving the dominant form of competition that capitalism embraces. It gets to a certain point where you need either economic crises or wars to resolve competing claims. And it's happened throughout the history of capitalism and is going to continue happening as long as you have this historic form whose hopefully, its time is past, but hopefully enough people will realize that in the not too distant future to move on to another historical form.
Ah.
Capitalism, our species didn't begin as capitalists.
Well, you brought up a heavy word there, competition. So again, I know it's both, it depends, but just jumping off, is competition more innate in humans or more invented? And let me just set it up with Nassim Talib's quote. Games were created to give non-heroes the illusion of winning. In real life, you don't really know who won or lost, but you can tell who a hero is and who is not.
That would require a lot of dismantling and explaining to go through each of those
Right.
sentiments.
But
Um,
in general, do
I
you think, are we hardwired for competition or did we
Well, see,
learn?
but it depends what you mean by competition. I
Yeah,
mean, when I was in left, we always used to talk about there's healthy competition
right.
and vicious competition. I
Yeah,
mean, basically, competition at times can simply be comparison, a kind of
yeah,
comparison, which in itself is iniquitous.
yeah,
And there is such thing as healthy competitions
yeah,
and working, and one can. It's not so. It's how you use this, and
yeah,
whether your competitive aspect is benefiting all of society or harming it. So I think in that sense, in a more general sense, you know, competition isn't what capitalism has made it. That it's transcends that.
yeah,
And it can be positive, it can be healthy, etc., depending on the kind of context in which it takes place.
yeah. And then, it goes into punishment. Someone responded to Talib's quote and said, villains don't think they are bad. They want control. Heroes want freedom. So I just morphed it into the next question is, what do you do with the villain or the hero? What do we do with the villain? We think punishment works. So my question to you is, does punishment work? Because like Gregory Bates, an anthropologist, and Doublebind says, when the criminal gets caught, do they think they did something morally wrong, or did they just go, my criminal skills weren't up to snuff that day? You
As
know,
many criminals as there are, you get different answers. I mean, that's kind of I wouldn't make a generalization just based on that.
but let's just go to the present. So what if we throw Trump in jail? That's what everybody wants. What will that do in the long run? Does punishment really work?
Well, it's more a commentary on the system. It's not so much punishment, especially at his age. What does it matter? That it's not going to make him a different. He is who he is. There's no way
Right.
he is ever going to be anything else.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact that a lot of us would like to see him poor and in jail and Bubba's plaything at Rikers Island, um, that is more a commentary on the system and whether the system can deal with those kinds of transgressions by those kinds of people. And it's more from that standpoint. I mean, I don't know, at least among my friends, I don't know anybody who has any interest or concern or care about what impact that would have on Trump, other than he would feel miserable.
Yeah. But like Maida, any of these guys, they just get their hands slapped and thrown in country club jail. So what?
Oh yeah,
It's
well, yeah,
it's not
that's
really
not.
addressed.
It's a
Yeah.
comment on the system and the structure of the
Yeah.
system and what it does. It's not so much on if you're talking about a different type of criminality and criminals, et cetera, and whether punishment leads them to better lives, et cetera. That's a kind of another question, more complex question, case by case.
If you had to vote right now for capital punishment, would you say yes, I'm for it, or no, I'm against it?
No, I don't think the state has any right to take another person's life.
Yeah.
The only qualifier I would add is in exceptional circumstances. For instance, um, if there had been let's say, a successful revolution in the United States in the 60s, early 70s, and the North Vietnamese wanted to try Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger for war crimes, which could entail the death penalty, I would say, fine, it's up to them. Send them those two war criminals. So, in exceptional
Yeah.
circumstances, where the
Yeah.
state feels it has to make a move like that. But other than those exceptional circumstances, I would not give that right to the state to take a life.
Steve, what's the difference between rights and responsibilities?
Um, well, that's something I've never heard that question before. And offhand, it seems like right is a much larger worldview kind of word. Responsibility is something more specific that comes with once you've figured out a right or rights. You're concerned with each of that comes with responsibilities, which is a way of achieving or carrying out or defeating whatever rights you're talking about. So they're related but different things.
John Basil Barnhill, socialist, he said, where the people fear the government, you have tyranny. Where the government fears the people, you have liberty. In 2005, the film V for Vendetta paraphrased it. People should not be afraid of their governments. Governments should be afraid of their people. So it brings up this word fear. How do you personally handle false fears like the war on drugs? So some government official who went over to our side said, you can't have a war on drugs because drugs don't fight. And you can't say no to drugs because drugs don't talk. So you know what I'm saying about this false fear. The
Yeah.
war on drugs, the war on terrorism, the war on poverty. How do you handle personally false fears?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by handling it personally. I mean, I see them as political ploys, as a way of mobilizing enough of the population to support the agenda of certain parts of the political leadership. But more than that, I don't give them much credence at all. And generally, they become an excuse for going after certain sectors of the population. You know, it's like I don't think they used the term, but like going back to the Espionage Act of World War One, the Smith Act leading to World War II, all these things are driven by fear. And wars against people who are disloyal, war on people who don't support unswervingly the government, etc. You know, these kinds of things that are used all the time. That's how I see them. I mean, how
Yeah,
you deal with them, you know, it becomes another reason for working for changing the system.
yeah. Very good. So James Joyce was the first projectionist in Dublin. He basically checked out, said, this is stupid. Why should I go inside a building and see a movie of a tree when I can go outside and see a real tree? Years later, years later, Years later, Faulkner said sometimes the best fiction is more true than journalism. Why do we have to recreate things in order to get them? Why do we have to go to a theatrical play of people acting out life? Why don't we just live life?
Yeah, but I think that's true. I mean, people should do that, and there should be a connection. I mean, going to see something different. I mean, you go to theater, et cetera, hopefully to expand to
Yeah,
to the extent you're capable within a theater, your experiences of the world,
yeah,
because everyone has limitations. Sure, you want to go out and live life, but that doesn't mean you can expose yourself to everything. And it's a way of broadening you to hopefully make you live a better life and experience more things by going into theaters, et cetera, you know, which is fine. So I have no problem with that. To me, it kind of goes together. To the extent the theater doesn't accomplish that, then you've wasted your money and your time.
yeah. You're good with the E word, Steve.
But
Explore,
there's a
explore, experience, and expand. There's a good
I
pattern there.
yeah, I really like that. It's funny as a thought occurred to me as you were mentioning those examples. There's a it's a little bit different, but you might enjoy it if you haven't heard the story. Uh, this involves Brahms, the great German composer,
Yeah.
and supposedly a friend came to him and with a ticket, he managed to score two tickets to a sold out performance of Mozart's Don Giovanni. And he was really pleased, and he was happy to tell Brahms that, look, we can go see this because it's all being talked about, etc. And Brahms just looked at him and said, well, why would I want to do that when I have the score here and I can read the score?
That's
Very different
that's
reception.
yeah. That's like it's a little different too, but it's a guy goes backstage at a Sun Ra concert and he goes up to him and says, "My kid could play that." And he goes, Sun Ra went, "But can he transcribe it?" So you sort of touched on this with the influence your dad had on you. So the question is what was the tipping point for you to study political science and go into international relationships and relations? But
Well,
we've sort of covered that. You can expound on it if you want. Yeah.
I could just tell you briefly because
Sure.
it's fairly succinct. Um,
Yeah.
I was born. Well, I mean, I lived through the Vietnam era, and I went
Yeah.
through all that. I was born in 1949. Anyway, as Vietnam heated up, and I spent a lot of time starting more and more in high school reading about politics. But one of the things that got me going academically in high school was chemistry and physics. I don't know why, but things started clicking for me when I took those classes. So I started at the University of San Francisco in the fall of '67 as a physics major. But my first week there during Welcome Week, before classes had begun, I realized I had just spent the summer reading and talking politics. And I was starting to work for G. McCarthy's campaign. And so I said, what am I doing? Enrolling as a physics major. So I switched to political science.
Amazing. That's really what I was looking for, the tipping point. But the next tipping point would be you have an amazing dedication to music and the love of music, but also to oral history and documenting, this very important area of LA, Central Avenue. So, what was
Yeah.
the tipping point, even before you did that? What was the tipping point for you to say, I love music? What was the roots of your love of music? And then I want to do oral history. What was the tipping point to go into oral history and music? Yeah.
Woo. Well, that's a big thing. I mean, when I was in college and started graduate school, my thing was foreign policy decision making. I was interested in international relations, et cetera. Well, as I moved through graduate school and my first year or two at UCLA, I was very disillusioned with the discipline, the field, until I started reading Marx, and that gave me a reason to carry on. And I became it came to dominate my work. And if you really understand it, you can't just simply be an academic. So I got involved in politics. Trotsky had an enormous influence on me. And I became involved with the Trotsky Spartacist League. So that's my political evolution. Well, the interesting thing is, I remember it early '79. At that point, I'm working on my dissertation, which is a very Marxist dissertation. And every Sunday, our Spartacist local would have their meetings, right? And one Sunday, three of my comrades who were former Black Panthers told me about this church they were going to just north of Watts. Now, this is early '79, spring '79. They were going down to hear a band led by a man named Horace Tapscott called the Pan-African People's Orchestra. And they said, I really should check it out. Well, as it turned out, I seem to have assignments on Sundays, so I never made it down with these guys. But the way they talk about Horace Tapscott and this movement, they created an aura of this underground genius who turned his back on the commercial world and was embedded in and dedicated to improving his community through the arts and political activity. Shortly afterward, I was transferred to New York, and that was the end of that. And also at that time, I wasn't a jazz fan. I was listening to opera, to classical. I was listening to some punk. I was listening to political folk music. That was my musical interest. So anyway, I'm away for a while. I come back to LA in the mid 80s to finish the dissertation. And I'd always wanted to play music. But especially when I got serious about academia, when I get really into something, I have to go all the way or not at all. And I didn't want to be a music hobbyist, treated not very seriously. When I finally finished the dissertation and I realized because of my politics, I wasn't going to get a regular job, I started studying saxophone with the teacher that everybody said was the go-to guy, a man named Bill Green. Now, this is 1987. And during that time, I had been developing an interest in jazz. That had been emerging before then. But I learned from Bill and a movie that came out then, a documentary called Ernie Andrews Blues for Central Avenue, which I wrote a review of. And my teacher, Bill Green, was part of the Central Avenue scene in the 40s. And he started telling me stories about it. And he started encouraging me, saying, look, why don't you do something? Nobody's documenting this history. Why don't you do something while we're all here? And I can introduce you to people. So this is kind of the tipping point where it began. I hadn't planned any of this. It had nothing to do with my background. Now, I realized pretty quickly there was nothing on Central Avenue anywhere. So I realized the only way to get at this was by interviewing people who were part of the scene. I had no background in it in my academic work. I knew UCLA had an oral history program that was world class. So I went there. I met with the director one morning in January '89 and told him, what I was thinking of doing. And he talked with me for 2 hours. And he said, look, why don't you do it with us and we'll equip you. And then he explained to me what they do in the oral history program, the way they support long interviews, they develop transcripts, produce bound volumes. And I thought, well, that's much better than I could do with a handheld recorder. So I agreed to work with them. And that began the Central Avenue Sounds Project in 1989. And basically, ever since then, all this stuff that just keeps evolving and keeps turning out, books, records, films, screenplays. I mean, the stuff that I've not planned at all to do, it just keeps evolving. As Ishmael Reed writes about in his great novel Mumbo Jumbo, it just grew.
It just grew. That was my first website. My first website ever was justgrew.org or something. But who was this guy at UCLA? Who was the guy at UCLA? The director
oral history guy.
Yeah.
His name was Dale Treleaven. TR11. Treleaven.
TR11. Very good. Yeah. Because I'm involved in this whole archive thing now. That was good. So let's go into music. So you really summarized your dedication to music. Did you pursue being a saxophonist?
I studied with Bill Green for 5 years. And I started on alto. And then 6 months later, he had me blowing soprano. And then he had me at B-flat clarinet and then flute. So I was working on 4 horns at once. And I was studying with Bill. I had a lesson every week, and I would practice 5 hours every day. I started in my apartment building near LACMA till the manager said the volume was getting too loud and he wouldn't allow it. So I would go to Pan Pacific Park, a convenient little nook there, and I'd blow for 5 hours every morning. Did that for 5 years.
And you continue to play now?
Nope. Another tipping point came in 94. I got a full-time teaching gig. And it was a high school gig. I was still teaching university classes, but this was a regular full-time gig that paid well.
Yeah.
And I forget at that point in my life, I had to go that way.
Yeah.
And but the problem was it was about 55 to 70 hours a week, and I had to make a choice. I couldn't do that.
Yeah.
Plus do the oral history interviews and work on books out of that, plus play my horns. There's no way I could do it. And I had to make a decision, and my decision was that I could make more of a contribution doing the research, the history, and the writing than blowing my horns. And I'm sad to say, very sad to say, that was probably true.
Well, no, I don't think it's sad to say. It's like we benefited because it led you probably you could have been a jazz saxophonist or the guy who wrote the great book on Central Avenue. So, we
Yeah.
benefited, Steve, but let's go into music for
Well,
a little.
thanks. I hope so.
Yeah. Well, I don't think you got to hope, dude. It's amazing. I mean, we've done events. I've shown the rare Horace Tapscott with you at Sponto Gallery and on and on. But here's the question right off the bat, getting into music. What's the function of music?
Just in general?
Again, you put in the context you want. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I would say music in the most general sense, that is art, is part of the definition of who we are. And the more that's brought, I think every individual has that. Some more than others, but it's there. And I think the more any society supports that and brings it out in people, the more successful that society is. And certainly the less conflictual it is. I think it's just an essential part of human nature. And the more it's suppressed, the more the society will suffer. And no better example than that of the purest laboratory in the history of capitalism, which is also known as the United States, of how suppression of all of this that has no positive, black bottom line is completely suppressed and eliminated. And to me, that's suppressing an essential part of who we are as people.
Yeah. It's a healing force. What's more fundamental, music or language?
Both together. Can you imagine one without the other?
Yeah.
In a way, language is music. When people
Yeah.
speak, their language is driven by their rhythm, which is their heartbeat, fundamentally. And that is a rhythmic pattern. There's music in everything, everywhere.
Yep. Totally agree. So my friend has the three tenets of music as technique, theory, and taste. So technique, you learned how to play the saxophone. Theory, you knew what chords and notes you were playing. How does one acquire taste?
Um, there's an important thing missing from that. And this is a problem with the Western tradition. When you talk about technique and theory, this
Yep.
is in the Western tradition, this is where music begins, right? You sit in a classroom, a staff goes up on the board, and you start getting introduced to it all. Well, as my friend Horace Tapscott used to call it, he said, that's censorship. You should never begin with a censorship. What's missing there is creativity. Before there is technique, before there is theory, there has to be creative expression before you acquire any of that. Otherwise, and that's the problem with much of the Western tradition, is that creativity is just something, supposedly, that is going to happen at some point as you spend all this time learning technique and theory. And creativity is just kind of pushed aside or into this mysterious black hole somewhere. And I think that approach is just completely back asswards. I think you have to begin with creativity. And then you can introduce other elements. To give an example, again, from Horace, you can see how big influence on me. When they used to offer classes to kids, they would have them come into a space. And this was going to be a music class, right? There would be no staff on the board, no instruments, no theoretical charts, nothing, no theory books, nothing. And they would have these kids express a musical feeling or idea with whatever they could in the room. And there might be books or erasers, or they could use the walls, the floors, anything. Just come in and do whatever you want. Just express whatever you're feeling. And they kept doing this. That's what the classes would be and would continue to be until those kids felt completely comfortable coming in and doing that.
Yeah.
And it's only then that they started with the technique and the theory.
Yeah.
Because it was, to me, it was so fundamental, so primal, and such an important lesson, too, for any aspiring artist, that what has to be primary are your creative impulses and what it is that really define you and what you're feeling. And then you find ways to express. And then, of course, a dialectic hopefully starts happening. But the point is then they're co-equal. It's not creativity, though, well, you have to suppress this because it doesn't fit into this theory. Or that's not the way you're supposed to play it on this instrument. Yeah. You find a way to create the sound then. If it doesn't fit into existing theory or technique, then you change it. It was like you mentioned Monk earlier. Monk used to be criticized early on, saying, well, you saw the way he started fingering pieces that looked like it was very stiff like this, right? Which was perfect for his staccato note selection. And critics were saying, oh, clearly the guy doesn't know how to play piano.
Right.
But it was such a classic example of how he realized that technique, is shaped by your creative needs.
Yeah.
So in that kind of thing, I would say, and then taste evolves. It has to be a blending or merging there.
Yeah. But it was interesting because my friend nailed it. He said, Thelonious Monk heard all the notes Charlie Parker heard, but only decided to play some of them.
True of any artist, yes.
Yeah, but I'm just curious, we had the great Mark Cantor show Jazz Films the other night, and he showed a clip of Pat Boone's TV show featuring Joe Williams. So, all you do is see Joe Williams performing amazing. And then at the very last second, Pat Boone comes out and shakes his hand. Now, you got to give him credit. Pat Boone gave this guy screen time. But my thing is like, how does one develop taste to like Joe Williams and not so much gravitate towards Pat Boone? How does taste happen?
Experience. That's your life experience.
Yeah.
What are they? I mean, Pat Boone's going to say something to his audience, and Joe Williams going to say something to his audience, and boy, are they different.
I know, it was amazing. So two of my film heroes have this mantras like George Manupelli says, ignore yourself. Jonas Mekas says, there is no self-expression. And Cecil Taylor, the jazz pianist, says, I'm just a vehicle and this stuff just comes through me. Again, it's dialectic again, but it is art making, music making. I know it's both and it depends, but just whatever you want to respond is fine. Is art making, music making more self-expression or more you're a vehicle for whatever technology, cultures, and environments are dominant?
Ooh, that's hard. That's very hard to find, to divide it that way and find that kind of separation. I think both enter into it. If you're part of the world, you can't escape what you're in the middle of. It surrounds you. It's in the air around you, whether you're aware of it or not. Social values, attitudes, etc., utterly pervasive. We were talking earlier about competition and things like this. Think of the way people grew up in this society. Americans are probably the most brainwashed people on the planet in these terms, in thinking human nature is this, atomized, competitive, individual, et cetera, et cetera. and all of that mythology, it's simply in the air all around us. There's nothing rubbing up against it anywhere practically. And so I think there are all those kinds of the society you're in, you can't escape that. That is all around you. All you can try and do is be as aware of as much as you can and be as honest as you can in your expression,
Yeah.
in your search for sounds and what really resonates with you. Honesty is the most important, and the willingness to go a way, that might be difficult, or to go beyond something you had thought previously, etc. Honesty is the key ingredient in any artist's evolution and development.
Really great word. Thank you, Steve, because James Brown's drummer said, living in Ohio, he had a factory on one side of his house and a railroad track on the other. So he basically invented, or was the foundation of funk drumming, because it was like chicka chicka tss, chicka chicka tss, and he was absorbing his environment. The
Yep.
real hidden question to this question is, can art making, music making be egoless?
What is egoless?
You answered a question with a question. You win,
Yes.
Steve. That's the section.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, let me tell you how this is transcribed over the years. Or for 20 years I've been asking this, and everybody goes, no, it has to have ego. And then someone finally said, great art is egoless. And I went, oh, that's interesting. And then someone a couple weeks ago goes, it has to be egoless. So, I mean, it really depends on how you define what ego is. So that's it. What is ego?
Well, a large part of it, I think people they're setting up a situation where an artist's own sense of self conflicts with ideally what is flowing through the artist, so that the artist is in a position to then realize, or to be a vehicle for forces he may not, or she, understand, and just lets it flow without his censor interfering. I assume that that's kind of a dichotomy they're thinking of.
Yeah.
That kind of setup, right? And I
It's
don't know
interesting.
that you can,
Yeah.
that's very complex. I don't know that the dichotomy really works all that well, but I can understand what they're driving at, which gets back to the point I made about honesty and being honest with yourself, your motivations, etc., and giving in to really authentic feeling without layering it with any other kind of agenda items, etc.
Yeah. Well, this is
So
good, because I left off one of my key questions because I didn't think it was really applicable. And then I thought, well, you could answer it in regards to what you think Horace's motivations were. But the question, I'm going to ask you these two questions, and you can put it into any context you want. I usually go, a screenwriting teacher told me great art is when you can clearly see the intention of the maker. Stanley Kubrick says, great art is when you can clearly not see the intention of the maker. What role does intention play in your creative process?
It's the same kind of, me in particular, you mean?
Well, then that's what I asked. Like, it is a creative process on how you choose to do oral history. That is a creative process. There's some creative process.
Yeah.
So what role
Yeah.
does intention play in your creative process?
Well, I mean, to an extent, it plays a role in setting up a process, et cetera. But one of the things I've always felt, and I've seen a lot of bad interviews done, and potentially good interviews short-circuited by interviewers with such a rigid sense of intention, shutting down their interviewees.
Right.
And you can see it. I mean, sure, you can see it happening when it does. I remember the most grievous example of this I saw was when somebody was being interviewed, and the interviewer who was working on a particular project kept saying, "Yeah, but look, Bill, you're not giving me what I want." Well, in no time, it was hard getting anything out of the
Yeah,
interviewee. That was terrible. His own purpose and intentions overrode and
yeah,
subverted the interview itself. To me, when I do interviews, I never have in front of me a list of questions.
yeah,
The most I do, I will meet with interviewees ahead of time. I will give them maybe a list of topics
yeah,
that we'd like to get over, but that's it. Because, I mean, especially coming from jazz, to me, I want the process to be as open,
yeah,
freewheeling, as improvisatory as possible,
yeah,
and as much as possible for my interviewee to be speaking without a censor. I mean, it's impossible for anyone to completely turn off, your individual censor, but that's sort of the objective. So to me, my intention is to assist the
yeah,
interviewee in giving the most full reminiscence they can provide without hesitation, to make them feel as relaxed, etc. And now that's also an intention on my part.
yeah,
Even though I have my own agenda and I'm researching certain things, etc., I also understand, especially in these things, that there's maybe a lot that I don't know about. And if
yeah,
I make this as open as possible, or if my interviewee starts heading down a track that I don't necessarily immediately see the relevance of or don't understand why we're going this way, I'm going to let him go,
yeah,
because you never know where it might lead. And I don't want to short circuit any of that. So, whatever intentions I come into a project with, et cetera, when I sit down with an interviewee, I want it to be as open and as freewheeling as possible. Now, I don't know if that addresses in my specific practice, what you were getting at in terms of intention, but in
no,
in
it perfectly addressed it, and it helped me understand my own process because I find doing interviews for 40 years, I'm just a student at this, and I'm continually doing it with the interviewee as a process to improve the whole process. But, a couple things. When I worked for George Carlin, we got this flyer in the mail and it says, "I'm trying to get more control over my spontaneity." And, you want it to be spontaneous, you know, and
yes.
and then Kurt Silsby, I interviewed him once, and he answered a question, and then I went to the next question. He goes, "Aren't you going to do a follow-up question on that one?" And it stuck with me forever. I know that listening is a key part of interviewing, but
Oh, yes.
it yeah, and giving that
Yes.
space. But
But I've
go
often
ahead.
said that you mentioned how much you learn from your interviewees.
Yeah,
I've always said that I've gotten a second PhD from 150 teachers.
that's it.
I mean, I've interviewed roughly 150, people, LA musicians mostly, et cetera, in the Black community, and some are visual artists, et cetera. And to me, I always refer to them as my teachers. They've given me another degree.
Totally. I'm the same way. Um, but Marcel Duchamp said there's no art without an audience. How much do you think of your reader when you're writing your book, say? When you're writing Central Avenue, how much are you thinking of your reader?
Well, um, more so in more recent work, but I've thought a lot about who I'm writing for and why I'm doing this. And the ones I think about more specifically are my readers of the Black community, people in the Black community.
Yeah.
That's who I'm writing for, and I want to make this history, as well as I can for the community. as,
Yep.
a tool, a vehicle.
Yep.
And it became even more specific when I started working on the history of Horace Tapscott's movement. And now I'm working on a second edition of my history of that movement. And what motivated me to explore doing that was a lot of the young bloods coming up and giving me a hard time about not being able to find the first edition, which has gone out of print, and being so expensive online. It's a collector's item now. And they motivated me and made me realize that everybody kept telling me, you got to read this, you got to get the history, you're involved in this movement, but they couldn't get it. And that
Yeah.
was my motivation. And especially with that later work in that book, I was really addressing it to those artists and
Yeah.
to the community around them. It's very specific with me. When Horace passed and I started working on that history, actually I started working on it with him when he passed. And when he did, I kind of rushed it. I wanted to get it out quickly because I knew what a loss that was for the movement. And I wanted all those musicians who gave so much to be able to sit back, talk about, and then look in published form at what they did. I wanted it to be a mirror
Yeah.
so they could see what they accomplished and how important it was. So I think even more so with that work, my people I was writing for and really focused on narrowed kind of to them. But obviously at the same time, I think it has universal relevance and
Yeah.
appeal. But that really has been my focus, has been the community and capturing this history and making it a part of a wider consciousness there.
Beautiful. Yeah, you may even consider putting a PDF on archive.org so anyone can read it at any time, But that's, you
Well,
might.
what's happening now is the second edition is in production now. It's going to
Good.
be out. So it'll be available in paperback and ebook.
Super cool. What's more important, conviction or compromise?
Well, how can you compromise without any conviction?
Well, that's like Louis Buñuel, the filmmaker, said, "I'm for anyone who seeks the truth, but I part ways when they claim they found it." So
Uh,
everybody and their mother said, "That's great." And one guy finally challenged it and he says, "No, that's bullshit. If I'm going to seek something, I want to find it." So my question is, the cliche goes, the journey is more important than the destination. Why do we have to name a destination or seek a destination if the journey's more important?
well, again, to me, I don't think in terms of these dichotomies.
Yeah.
I think the journey is crucial. It's very important. You mentioned conviction. I think before you can do anything, you have to have convictions. It's definition of who you are as a person, of how you function in the world. So when you talk of compromise, you're meeting people with other convictions, and that's what it's based upon. And I think it's very important also. So it's that kind of thing. The journey is very important, but you need an end result too. What's the point of working for revolution if there is no possibility of a revolution ever happening? I mean, yeah, the journey is important, but you're doing it in the reasonable expectation that this is a good thing to do. It's positive for humanity, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, one without the other, in a sense, to me, makes no sense.
Yeah. Is perception reality?
Of a sort, yes.
T.S. Eliot said poetry is outing your inner dialogue. What language is your inner dialogue in?
Well, or an improviser is merely playing the song his spirit is singing.
Oh, that is good.
Well, it's good. It comes from my favorite bass player, Roberto Miranda.
He said that. Say the
Yes.
quote one more time. Say it one more
Roberto
time.
has said it over and over that an improviser is simply playing the song his spirit is singing.
The song his spirit is
Is
singing.
singing.
Yeah, that is good.
Isn't that great?
That is beautiful. I miss that guy. I used to watch him all the time at LACMA. Wow, what a player.
I just saw him last Sunday night at the world stage playing with David Murray. It was great.
Woo! David Murray, another hero.
Yeah.
So you've done a lot in your history as an oral historian, your pursuit to preserve this important jazz story. Tell me one major element that's stayed the same since you started and one major element that's changed.
Well, certainly one thing that's stayed the same is how much I love the interviews.
Yeah.
You know, I've had at times a few difficult interviews, but for the most part, it's just been magical. And it's like when I finished Central Avenue, I thought, you know, that I really look back at the 37 people I interviewed as now an extended family of aunts and uncles.
Right.
I mean, the thing about oral history interviews, they're not journalistic. You don't go in, you don't sit down for half an hour, answer a bunch of set questions, and you're done. You're meeting for session after session, and you're doing these modified life histories of people. So, and this happened in many of the cases that I was involved with. You know more about them than their family does. So you develop a kind of closeness and rapport. At least I felt that. And I utterly treasure that to this day. And there are no, as I had a couple of interviews that were difficult for various reasons, but for the most part, I mean, I just treasure every one. Even the difficult ones were fine. There were some
Yeah.
problems, but just so that's the positive thing, and that hasn't changed. And I still, you know, I did an interview last year again. It just, and I never tire of it. I just
Yeah.
love the process. The the other part of it you said were things that might have changed or been disappointing or
Well, not disappointing, just one major element that stayed the same and one major element that changed.
changed. Uh, Gee, what's changed? Well, I mean, I don't know if this is probably not what you're getting at, but I found myself getting pulled in a lot more directions and into different areas that I really had no experience with, but I got involved anyway because of all the work I've done
Yeah.
on the jazz history. And that's been different. A lot of the way things have branched off into other areas, visual arts, film projects, and things like this. Um, but in that process, I trying to think. I don't know that much has change has happened in that way.
Yeah, no, yeah, that's
Getting
that
I could
answers.
talk about a lot of those other projects and things, but that's I don't know if that's what you're after.
No, that was fine. Moshe Feldenkrais works with healing and movement. He says it's literally possible to identify a weakness and incorporate it to become a strength rather than we're taught to overcome a weakness. Tell
Ah,
me a tell me a weakness you turned into a strength.
oh boy. Um, in this process, doing this work,
Again, you put in the context you want in your life in general, or as an oral historian, or as a political scientist, or
yeah,
international relationships person. Any context you want.
yeah. Um, well, it's interesting. I mean, one thing. Oh well, no, that really wasn't. I mean, there's certain things that I hadn't done before and wasn't necessarily good at, but I got better,
Yeah,
as the thing evolved.
yeah.
I mean, one thing I felt for a long time, and actually I still feel this. um, why me?
Yeah.
I'm not. I'm not the person who should be doing all this. I'm not the person who's qualified to be doing this. For instance, granted that I studied with Bill Green for 5 years, I knew my way around a few horns. But I had no background in theory. I wasn't a musicologist. Here I am going into an area that academics call ethnomusicology,
Right.
of which I have absolutely, I mean, what background I have now has come from my reading on my own, but no training in that. And I'm spending all my time sitting down with incredible jazz musicians. And I don't know music theory. I can't sit down and go over a score with them in any
Yeah.
kind of depth, or anything like that. And granted but my focus had always been that area where art and politics met,
Yeah.
and the social setting and the social context. And that's what most of my work has gotten out. And I like to think in some cases gotten with people like Buddy Collette and Horace Tapscott into the whole process of creation, et cetera, et cetera. But I've always felt that to be, to a certain extent, a handicap on my part. To an extent, I've kind of worked around it, I guess you could say. But that's certainly one. Actually, I got some validation a while ago when I read Shostakovich's memoir, Testimony. I finally got around to reading it. And at one point, he writes about people who were always asking him about inspiration or why he did something in a score. And he said, in my Eighth Symphony, if I resolved these chords in this particular way and the third movement, et cetera, he goes, who cares? I don't want to talk about that. And I thought, oh, thank you, Dimitri.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah, it's just like Stravinsky giving his lectures on music means nothing. So that's an extreme, and you can process it. But the other extreme is that it means everything. And I mean, to me, what Horace did was put music as a tool for community.
yeah.
And that's the communities playing. I mean, I saw the Pan African orchestra play 2 or 3 weeks ago at the Watts Towers. I was in tears the whole time. These kids, they were doing, I mean, you saw all the pros play before them, and then you saw them come out, and it was like, whoa, where did they get these people? And it's like from this community.
Yes.
It was
The other thing that has been on my mind a great deal is the fact of, in terms of why me,
Yeah.
it's a question of background.
Yeah.
Partly that, but also, especially when it came after Central Avenue to moving into the period from the 60s to the present, I was dealing with different people and different artists. With Central Avenue, those were people in the 30s, 40s, and 50s who were basically fighting for integration.
Yeah.
Right. Now I'm moving into a world of nationalism, of Black nationalism, et cetera. And I knew Horace was in the middle of that.
Yep.
So the more I got involved with Horace, I mean, that was an issue. But I think because Horace is the one who brought me in, I wasn't confronted with as much of that. I'm sure there was talking on the side, et cetera, et cetera. But once you have Horace's imprimatur, basically the door is open. But that was on my mind for a while. But I know some of my friends had my back, et cetera. And then I also learned too that in the community, if you prove yourself, if you're there, and if what you're doing is to advance the interests of the community, then you're embraced.
Yep. It's beautiful. You brought up the word honesty a couple times. This is a question I got from Marcel Proust's questionnaire. On what occasion do you lie?
What occasion? Well, I try and have very few occasions like that. I think sometimes, I don't know, depending on how you define lying, I will shade things or phrase things a certain way in the interest of not hurting somebody or family or things like this. Or I'll deliberately obscure or obfuscate or not bring up something I know to be the case and just let an existing inaccuracy stand.
I asked for 90 minutes. We got about 5 more minutes. Can you go a few more over, or you got to go in 5?
I'm fine. Go for it.
Okay, we'll just do a few more, and I really appreciate this, Steve. It's been truly enlightening. Anger can be a productive emotion when fill in the blank.
When you have just and righteous cause and when you can have an impact.
How do you find peace of mind?
Put on the music.
Nice.
Put on the music. Healing tones.
Healing tones. Bright moments, as
Oh,
Rahsaan Roland Kirk would say.
and that's when we were doing signings for Central Avenue Sounds. Horace would always write bright moments. Horace tells
Oh, isn't that nice? If you were walking down the street today and you met yourself as a 12-year-old, what would you say to your 12-year-old self?
Oh man, I would say be more open and exploratory about the world.
Wow. Well, I think you took it on because you've explored a lot. So these are 5 Alan Watts questions, just in a few words off the top of your head. First one, who started it all?
Well, I guess you could say it was, in my case, it was two. It was a nameless Neanderthal and a nameless Homo sapien.
Very good. Are we going to make it?
Yes. You can't be a revolutionary and not be an optimist.
Good going. Third one, where do we put it?
In the heart.
Oh my God, you're knocking them out of the park. Fourth, who's cleaning it up?
Who's cleaning it up? We will. We'll be out on the sidewalk with our brooms, sweeping because it has to be done.
Beautiful.
It's like, yeah.
Fifth, Alan Watts. Go ahead.
Just to add something to that, because an image
No.
just flashed in my mind.
Go ahead. Totally.
Barbara Morrison, you know who she was?
Oh, of course.
Right? Great jazz vocalist, blues vocalist. You know, she had her own performing arts center in Leimert Park.
Yeah.
And I remember I was down there I think I was at S1 Books one morning. It was about 10 o'clock in the morning. And I looked down toward the end of Degnan Boulevard. And who do I see down there? 10 o'clock in the morning with just a smock on, broom in hand, sweeping the sidewalk. It's Barbara out in front of her theater. And I thought, that's it.
That's it. That's the real deal.
She's down with it.
She is. She was the real deal. I loved every moment I saw her. In fact, she told me the best joke for musicians, and I'll repeat it because I love this joke, and I got it from her. I was driving to a gig one day in my car, and I saw a hitchhiker, and he had a guitar in his hand. I goes, well, I got to pick up a fellow musician. So she pulls over, and the guitarist gets in the car and she says, so are you a musician? And he goes, no, I'm a magician. And then he put his hand on my leg and I turned into a hotel. That is a good joke. I'm telling you, it always gets a laugh.
Yeah.
Okay, the last Alan Watts is it serious?
Ooh, without that, you got nothing.
It's good. Okay, a couple more. We're out of here. Tell me something good you never had and you never want.
Something good that I never had and never want. A comfortable home in the suburbs.
That is a good answer. If you were in a vat of vomit up to your neck and someone threw a bag of shit at your face, what would you do?
I think I just sink.
Think.
Oh man.
3 more and we're out of here, Steve. What's the cultural shift you see developing today that inspires you?
Well, actually, if you don't mind me being very precise and specific,
Of course, any way you want.
for a lot of years now, I've felt doing the work I do in the community, I felt very alone. I've always wondered, going for what, 30, 40 years now that I've been doing this work,
Yeah,
why aren't all these other people down there researching this, writing this history? Where are all the dissertations? And I can never, never understand that.
yeah,
And also, over the not a lot, for various reasons, since the 80s, not a lot of young people have been emerging and coming along involved in this community arts movement. Well, what has changed now over about the last 7, 8 years, there I've really been feeling this transformation. There are younger people, I'm talking about the people in their 20s now, who are now leading the Pan African People's Orchestra. And
yeah,
you saw them at the Watts Towers, more young people than at any time since the 70s, who are emerging, who are interested in this stuff, who want to know more. And that isn't just in LA. I mean, the interest now internationally in this has just blown me away. I've recently been communicating with a magazine in Finland. There was recently a large article in the French daily newspaper Liberation that focused on Horace and the movement and community arts movement in LA. I mean, and there is the generation that's emerging now is showing more interest than in decades. And not only in terms just of the music, I've encountered some young filmmakers and a couple of young academics and writers who are spending time now in the community and getting interested. So for me, this is just so pleasing and gratifying and satisfying, after so many years in the wilderness on my own.
yep. It's really beautiful. So Thornton Wilder, playwright, 1928, he said, "Art is confession, the secret told. But art is not only the desire to tell one's secret, it's the desire to tell it and hide it at the same time."
Jerry, you broke up. I didn't
Yeah,
hear all of Thornton Wilder.
I'll read it again, no problem. Art is confession. Art is the secret told. But art is not only the desire to tell one's secret, it's the desire to tell it and hide it at the same time. You've laid your cards on the table for over 90 minutes. I'm not insinuating you haven't already answered this, but Steve, what's it really all about for you?
Oof. It's more almost a situation of what has it become about,
Yeah,
because it's evolved. I
yeah,
started out on this with a very specific and narrow focus,
yeah,
as just a researcher.
yeah,
And by 97, after I found out, watching me for a few years, Horace Tapscott, when we were working on his autobiography, said to me one day, "Now you're one of our wordsmiths."
wow.
And that kind of blew me away. But to me, it's one of the great honors of my life. But that also, in addition, gave me another kind of existence, a deepening, a broader involvement, seeing myself as part of something larger. And especially after, pulling out a full-time involvement in the left, this gave me another kind of political artistic vehicle that gave me a tremendous amount of personal satisfaction and involvement that did resonate with a lot of my earlier experiences and thinking. I mean, going back to when I was a kid, it just a lot of things kind of pulled together. And yeah, it's
Full
always
circle from full circle from when your dad had you on the picket line at 4 to now, you're still in a way, supporting the working class musician,
Yeah, most definitely.
and yeah,
Most
beautiful.
definitely.
Last question, Steve. Thank you so much. What gives you the most optimism?
The most? Well, I suppose it's not a particular event or incident now, but it's just the feeling. I think one of the things that came out of all the work I did politically and in the left and the understanding and my thinking through a lot of the theories and political history, et cetera, um, it gave me a real strong conviction about what I see as the nature of things
Yeah,
and how things unfold. And the one thing I feel certain of is that there will be opportunities in the future to finally rid ourselves of this kind of a system. But
yeah,
what gives me pause is, and is a cause, for concern, is that it's not inevitable,
yeah.
that it may not succeed. And as Rosa Luxemburg once said, the choice in the future is socialism or destruction.
Yeah.
And it may not succeed. Humanity may succeed in obliterating most of itself. There's no guarantee.
It's really beautiful. You have a great spirit about you, and I've always appreciated it. The first question I asked was, "What gives you? What's the best thing for a human being?" And I got that question from someone who studied Wilhelm Reich, and he said the best thing for a human being is another human being. And your
I like
answer was music and community. That's what it's like.
yes,
What more
yes,
could you ask for? Music and
yeah,
community. And then the last question I got from what they asked Groucho Marx at the end of his life is what gives you the most optimism? And he said, other people. So, your your
uh,
yeah, your emphasis on this feeling. In order to have feeling, it has to be shared with other people. You know,
yes,
there's something about this word community that, you know, I think words evoke more than their meaning. It's come unity,
yes,
come to the
yes.
unity. So onward and upward, Steve. Thank you so much for your time. It was truly enlightening, and I sure learned a lot. And hope we can continue the discussion forever and ever, even if it's at Stephen Lasker's parties, or
Hey, we get
or
a
or
lot talked about at Steve's place.
yeah, or when I'm sweeping the floor in front of Beyond Baroque for another big Steve event, we can
It's,
hang out there.
Jerry, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much, man.
Thank you, dude. It was super cool.
All right. You be
Okay,
well.
we'll be in touch.